K is for killer. Agatha Christie wrote that crime is terribly revealing. Try and vary your methods as you will, your tastes, your habits, your attitudes of mind, and your soul is revealed by your actions. Hello, students, and welcome to The Crime Scene, a podcast about 20th century crime and detective fiction. For each episode, my job is to help you better understand and appreciate the material we're studying this term. I'm your host, David Wilson, and in today's show, we take an in-depth look at the fictional serial killer. Serial killing is actually a rare crime, but we don't get that impression when we read crime fiction, watch thrillers, and listen to true crime podcasts. Over the last 50 years or so, there's been a high percentage of serial killers depicted in our culture. Why is that? Well, audiences are drawn towards narratives that feature horrific murders from the worst kind of criminals. Our fascination with homicidal maniacs is mixed with revulsion and shows no signs of waning. In short, we like the chills and the thrills, whether the story is factual or not. Now, the notions of serial murder can be traced back to Jack the Ripper in 1888 London, and that figure casts a long shadow on the subgenre of serial killer fiction, as well as the lurid newspaper reports at the time of such killings and the melodramatic, sensational fiction throughout the late 19th century, and it's really resonated all the way up to the true crime genre that we have today in the 21st century. So there's a real blurring of genres when it comes to the serial killer. We get to learn about Jack the Ripper, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, the son of Sam Zodiac Killer, and then we get to learn about fictional serial killers in the works of, say, Stephen King, Tom Harris with The Silence of the Lambs, films like Freddy Krueger in Nightmare on Elm Street, or Jason in the Friday the 13th movies, or Michael Myers in the Halloween movies. But we can go all the way back to like folktales, such as Bluebeard, who was murdering his wife. And we can also go back to some early films, not just Psycho, the 1959 film by Alfred Hitchcock with Norman Bates, but also fiction from the 50s, The Killer Inside Me by Tom Thompson, and Dorothy B. Hughes' great serial killer book In a Lonely Place from the 1940s. And even farther back, Hitchcock's one of his early films, The Lodger from 1927, featured a serial killer. And Fritz Lang, that famous director, had a serial killer in his 1931 film, M. So the modern serial killer whodunit, it's a popular genre, and it's difficult to avoid today, almost cliched in a way and overdone, but it had quite a popularity and an originating story during the golden age of detective fiction and murder mysteries in Britain, of all places, in the 1930s and 40s. Let's start with a bit of a definition here of serial killer. The Oxford English Dictionary explains that a serial killer is a person who commits a series of murders, often with no apparent motive, and typically following a characteristic or predictable behavior of pattern. And we can trace the term serial killer back to about the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in the West with law enforcement, and this is when public interest rose to where today the figure is really a pop culture phenomenon. But the figure has its roots all the way back in those monsters and vampires and werewolf stories and folk tales that go all the way back to ancient times and 19th century Gothic fiction. But it's been repackaged and updated from these prototypes and continues to resonate in society today. When we think of the serial killer in fiction, often this character is depicted as an everyman, someone who is average and outwardly normal, but they have a deep, dark secret. They're this mysterious outlaw that nobody quite knows about, that inside there's something abnormal, some deviant psychological process at work. So they kind of represent the monstrous behind an average human face, this boogeyman figure. So they both work on a familiar and sort of foreign otherness level. Many serial killers in fiction follow a first-person narration. The difficulty with uncovering them is that they don't seem to have a motive. So the figures is fascinating because it raises so many questions on social, political, and philosophical levels about families and power and corruption and compulsion. And then on the other side, in serial killer fiction, we have the detective or the police officer who becomes kind of a mind hunter, a profiler, trying to follow forensic psychology. So we often see serial killers in fiction with police procedurals, another subgenre, where these investigators are trying to uncover the motives, trying to read the serial killer's mind. As for readers, we are left acting as silent observers, spectators, watching events as kind of helpless witnesses. Now, throughout the ABC murders, readers believe that a serial killer is committing the murders, and they're following this alphabetical pattern of names and places. And this gives the police and Poirot a chance to prevent future killings if they're quick and clever enough. So in this way, they're drawn into this cat and mouse game with the culprit. At least this is the reader's first impression. Christie's novel is an early example of a murder mystery novel featuring a serial killer, but it's not actually the first. There were quite a few several Golden Age mysteries who employed this type of character. I think there were 3 of them in 1928, and S.S. Van Dyne created one. And there's a friend of Agatha Christie, Anthony Berkeley, who was also a member of that famous detective club with her, who titled his murder mystery The Silk Stocking Murders. And it featured a serial killer. But note the title, Silk Stockings. So Christie's kind of doing a riff on the figure and even Anthony Berkeley's novel because, silk stockings factor into the narrative. She's not ripping them off. She's just extending it her own way. When we look through the ABC murders, note that the term serial killer is never really used. It comes close a couple times. We see, a madman, is taken seriously, says Poirot. A madman is a very dangerous thing. A bloody homicidal maniac is mentioned. We're up against a homicidal maniac, says Hastings. They mention Jack the Ripper. They say he's very interested in this chain or series types of murders, says Hercule Poirot to Dr. Thompson. So as I mentioned, they come close. And another character, Megan Bernard, says at one time, "You really mean that my sister was killed by this horrible homicidal maniac?" So throughout the book, the assistant commissioner says, we're looking for a madman. Suppose we refuse our lunatic, says Crome. So they're trying to profile and find the psychology of the killer throughout the narrative, whom they call, a criminal lunatic, a homicidal maniac. And this is often repeated in the newspaper reports throughout the novel too. A homicidal maniac, lunatic, unhinged, the mind of a madman, this devilish cunning of insanity. They say he's Jack the Ripper all over again. So it becomes this mind game throughout, trying to figure out the why. And it isn't until the end that we completely understand what's going on behind the scenes here. Because Agatha Christie in the ABC murders adapts the serial killer figure. So instead of the Golden Age mystery trope of investigators, with sort of a closed circle of suspects and one victim, it's often the suspects are friends, neighbors, colleagues, and relatives. She decides to use this device as a false clue, the red herring, to distract readers. So quite clever, quite different, quite innovative in what she's trying to do. So the readers mistakenly suspect that a stranger is committing the murders and taunting Poirot. And it isn't until the end of the novel that we learn who the real culprit is and who's actually controlling this other individual. So the way the narrative is framed means that readers actually sympathize and identify with this suspected murderer and serial killer, because note how Hastings is recreating some of the scenes in third person throughout the narrative. So in the ABC Murders, Agatha Christie manipulates readers and how they gather the information and the clues by interspersing first person with third person episodes that are filtered through a character with a seemingly disturbed mind. So these episodes are placed near the murders, and she kind of uses ABC's deterioration and disintegrating mind to keep motives unclear. So readers wrongly assume and suspect that this individual, this ABC, is a serial murderer. Then the real murderer appears a little bit at the midpoint of the novel, but isn't a full-blown prime suspect till the end, when he is confronted by Hercule Poirot and the motives are discovered. So it's quite fascinating how serial killer here is invented as a fake killer by Christie, and how she frames him for the crimes and uses this great device of the red herring as kind of a fall guy. And readers all swallow this as we go along the narrative. If you're interested in serial killers, I recommend Erik Larson's book, The Devil in the White City, came out a few years ago. Or you could watch the film Seven with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. There's been lots of analysis done recently. A book called Natural Born Celebrities, Serial Killers in American Culture by David Susskind is one I would recommend, or one by Philip Simpson that came out about 20 years ago, Psychopaths, Tracking the Serial Killer Through Contemporary American Film and Fiction. Yes. Well, thanks for joining me on this episode of The Crime Scene. If you've got any questions, please review the module notes, send me an email. And remember what Agatha Christie said: people with a grudge against the world are always dangerous. Until next time, keep reading and writing, and we'll see you online.